Explanations by Pataha and Billy. Important excerpts from Contact Conversations. 623rd Contact Whitsunday, May 24, 9. Translation by FLAU, 12th December 2015.
It troubles me again that I have to say something in regard to the overpopulation, because the world must be saved from it. Unfortunately, however, nothing is done about it because, on the contrary, the entire thing is still promoted by the governments and authorities by human beings still getting money for having children. In this regard, be it high amounts for births or other monetary benefits which are paid out by the authorities, and so forth. Furthermore, it must also be said that often, recklessly and irresponsibly, without thinking, wanted or unwanted offspring are brought into the world by human beings who are incapable of bringing them up. As a consequence of lacking the right education, these children then fall into asociality, become depraved and engage in modes of behavior which deviate from the societal norms and harm the society and burden the world. Naturally, however, there are also quite normal human beings who are righteous and good citizens, who produce descendants who then contribute to the overpopulation. Thereby, very many parents only think of themselves and of their own joys which they want to have with children. However, no thought arises that thereby also one must pay heed to the well-being of the earth and bear responsibility for it, and indeed in the regard that through the machinations of the increasing overpopulation, nature and its fauna and flora as well as the climatic order are destroyed. The earth is not only full of human beings, rather it is boundlessly overpopulated. And this overpopulation continues to grow at a frantic pace. Consequently, the earth becomes incessantly fuller, namely, with an average of around 1 million human beings per year. Already the world population amounts to over 8.5 billion and increases incessantly further, because nothing is undertaken against it by either those responsible for the world and the mightful ones of state, or by the population of the world, such as in the necessary form of a regulated worldwide stop to births and a therewith connected birth control. Already for decades, that has been bringing about many kinds of very bad consequences, such as also come forth quite unambiguously from the limited natural resources on the planet Earth, which are feloniously exploited for the sake of vile profit, inflicting monstrous wounds on the earth which cannot be healed. The whole earth, its climate and nature, with its fauna and flora, but also the human being of the earth himself or herself, are disadvantageously burdened as a result of the overpopulation and tremendously irresponsible machinations, through which irreversible destructions are called forth, the origin of which is not caused by nature, rather it is solely attributable to the criminality of the terrestrial humanity. If the facts of the increasing environmental pollution due to the mass of humanity are viewed and considered, as well as the increased global warming and the fact that very many more human beings increasingly annoy each other, as well as that the mighty ones of diverse countries always evoke new wars worldwide, and terror organizations of many shades carry out their felonious mischief, then the future of the earth for the terrestrial humanity does not look exactly rosy. Unfortunately, the fact is that, in defiance of the risks in regard to the overpopulation, in regard to useful and right solutions, the whole thing of a worldwide stop to births and an effective birth control is quite tricky. If namely that is spoken about, then immediately the personal private right of the human being is put forward, which is cut back and limited by such measures, because the begetting of offspring and therefore having children would indeed be an absolutely private matter, and it would be unethical to dictate to human beings how many children they are permitted to have. But that can really no longer be the case if the humanity and the home planet Earth and its climate, nature and fauna and flora are to be preserved and continue to exist, however, with very many fewer human beings who poison and destroy a tremendous amount less of the biosphere, the possibilities for life, the planet, nature and its fauna and flora. But that is not thought about, rather only that a birth stoppage and a birth control would be a despotic regime that would disregard the fundamental right of human beings in regard to reproduction and personal freedom. Therefore, regarding this, rigorous measures are rejected, because the human being is simply the only being on the earth which can consciously decide in such a private form, indeed, that he or she can bring as many children into the world as he or she wants and as he or she pleases, regardless of which consequences emerge from that, and regardless of if the earth thereby totally perishes and the humanity perhaps exterminates itself, because the overpopulation becomes so great one day that it can no longer sustain itself. There are many examples for that in regard to past great cultures, which simply vanished from the surface of the earth. And such events are also known in the animal world, such as when an animal population becomes too big it then either ends its own life or it is reduced to a bearable amount through illness or rampantly spreading diseases. Therefore it is urgent that finally options are taken into consideration which curb the population growth, and indeed not only a little bit, rather, tremendously, when it is considered that the planet Earth is only made to accommodate a population of millions. Therefore it is urgently necessary that every single human being of the earth, woman as well as man, ultimately helps so that a worldwide birth stoppage and a regulated, fair and right as well as federally controlled birth control comes about. Solely through that alone can the environment and the humanity generally be saved from their downfall. If the entire catastrophic disaster is considered which since in the New Age has been caused through the machinations of the earth, humanity, and the continuously growing, horrendous overpopulation, in the form of thousands of kinds of eliminations and destructions to the planet Earth, the climate, the bodies of water, fields, meadows, and forests, as well as to the entirety of nature generally and to its fauna and flora, as well as due to other monstrous things, such as illnesses, wars, disadvantages, rampantly spreading diseases and terror in regard to the earth humanity, then no words can be found any more for that, and everything can only be clothed in the term horror. And if a prognosis is to be made for the earth humanity, then all there is to say is that a gloomy future is to be expected, because the frightful effects of the population growth impact on the environment so destructively that everything and anything will perish. Thereby playing an important role is also the factor of the human being of the earth becoming older and older, whereby there is also research undertaken for a radical prolonging of life, which will lead to very many very old human beings contributing to the overpopulation growing even more. Many who research extending the life have tried already for a long time, and indeed already since ancient times, to find out how the life of human beings can be endlessly lengthened. And as everything in the present time develops very rapidly, in the coming decades they will really find ways to solve the problems of aging and dying. That will certainly mean much difficult research work, and will be no more stoppable than the growth of the overpopulation, if intellect and rationality are not finally used in order to recognize the effect of reality and its truth and to necessarily take the right measures and carry them out to the bitter end, in which only million human beings, or at the most perhaps 1 billion human beings, populate the earth, who then must strive over many centuries or even millennia to arduously regenerate everything that today's humanity has eliminated and destroyed since in only around years, already making great areas of the earth uninhabitable. It is fundamentally necessary that now finally there is a beginning to working out measures that reach worldwide against the overpopulation and very quickly implementing them, because if there is simply further waiting and nothing is done, then the entire thing will only become very much worse. The world population grows every day by hundreds of thousands of human beings, and this is also when those around 160 who die are subtracted. The entire thing is comparable with the 9-headed Lernaean Hydra from Greek mythology, with which, when one head was cut off, immediately 2 more would grow back. Concerning human beings, that means that when one human being dies, 2 new ones are born. But the governors, the mightful ones of state, the politicians and authorities do nothing against that, just as the humanity itself does nothing. Consequently, the overpopulation can further spread. In the new time, and indeed especially already from the 20th century, which however self-evidently also applies to the current time, it was and is always arranged for that small, bigger and very big families are supported by the state, by religions and sects as well as by aid organizations, and so forth. And indeed, even when the couples cannot afford any children, or they do not care about the children and let them go to rack and ruin. Actually, today it is the case that the more child money and social welfare is paid, the more children are conceived and born, which, as insane as it is, promotes an excessive begetting of children more than ever, because conscienceless and irresponsible parents speculate on the child bonuses and social bonuses as well as on aid money and gifts. The fact that also that contributes to no thoughts being made in regard to the overpopulation does not worry anybody. Machinations, and only in this regard is there a calculation, because the human being has only developed in this material direction. Therefore nothing else concerns him or her, also not all the catastrophes such as earthquakes, wars, rampantly spreading diseases, primeval storms of all kinds and extreme weather catastrophes, terrorism, tsunamis, volcanic eruptions, felonies of a political or religious sectarian kind, as well as tremendous forest fires, and so forth. But quite especially the insidious global disaster of the overpopulation does not worry anyone, nor are its eliminating and destroying consequences seen, nor are the global climatic warming, environmental pollution and the exploitation of resources as well as the depletion of resources, and so on and so forth. However, the limit to the individual freedom is where it is necessary in order to preserve, that is to say, to save and make healthy and capable of life again everywhere, the continued existence of humanity as well as of the planet Earth as well as its nature, fauna and flora. However, the human being of the Earth takes the right to continue to irresponsibly cultivate the overpopulation, which has already been in excess for a long time, to an even greater degree. This is so because he or she has fallen into the delusion, at least the absolute majority of humanity, of having an individual right to selfishly not give a damn about the environment, the planet, the waters, wetlands, acres, fields, forests and meadows, all of the fauna and flora, and about the prosperity and adversity of the individual human being and indeed of the entire humanity. Thereby he or she has fallen into the delusion that he or she may accept that everything essential for life is ruined, eliminated and destroyed, if only his or her own egoism and well-being and all personal advantages can be maintained. Only a few are concerned that, with this irresponsible action and this mode of life which is antagonistic to life, the right to existence and to life of not only individuals, rather of all human beings is curtailed and put into question. The ones who act selfishly do not deal with the rights to life of the community in the form in which they deal with their private right, which they claim for themselves, because truly they stop at nothing and let their fellow human beings die miserably, if they thereby gain an advantage for themselves and, according to their understanding of personal rights, can irresponsibly bring more children into the world than is allowed to them and can be rightful. They have fallen to the delusional belief that they are allowed to procreate at the expense of fellow human beings and without any consideration for them, for nature and its fauna and flora as well as the planet, and indeed without a responsible family planning and world population planning being necessary. However, the fact is that in earlier times of the history of humanity, that was effectively unnecessary, but in the current time of the terribly rampantly spreading overpopulation, it must be an absolute necessity based on a consciousness of responsibility. Earlier it was also the case that before Drignas Philip Semmelweis came, born first Jolly Buddha, Budapest, Hungary, died 13th August Vienna, Austria, and introduced an effective hygiene in the hospitals. Innumerable children and women died at childbirth, and thus nature had culled in a brutal way, as it also had through illnesses, hunger, war and rampantly spreading diseases, and so forth. Now, however, since the human being of the earth has raised the quality and duration of his or her life very much and continues to drive it higher, he or she must change his or her thinking and adapt to the new time as well as to its circumstances and thereby also to the necessity of a worldwide stop to births and an effective birth regulation, in order to put a stop to the overpopulation, to reduce it and to no longer let it continue to spread. The entire humanity of today must concern itself with a very greatly changed reality and do everything conceivably necessary to indeed still prevent the ultimate great terrors which inevitably arise out of a further idiotic stupid cultivation of the overpopulation. The matter is indeed hard to tackle and means great terror for the earth humanity, but it is always better to make a painful break than to endure the agony which is endless and comes with an inevitable demise. A worldwide stop to births with the following birth regulation is the best compromise in order to master the overpopulation dilemma, even if thereby in this regard the personal rights of the human being must be reduced for the good of the entire humanity as well as of the planet, nature and its fauna and flora and their continued existence. If thereby all other rights of freedom are protected, then the general welfare of the entire Earth population as well as of the planet, nature and its fauna and flora actually have a real chance of being saved otherwise.
625th Contact Saturday, 15th August 5.44.
But something else. The Islamist state continues to commit ongoing machinations which are felonious and very badly out of the control of the good human nature, against which the Iraqi and Syrian military as well as the British and U.S. American aircraft squadrons, which are deployed against the IS, do much too little and not the right thing to exterminate the Islamist state. On one hand, many military people and pilots probably enjoy being able to make war, whereby probably love of adventure or a joy of killing and destroying play a decisive role. On the other hand, with the entire matter of the lax actions against the IS, the participating countries' profit-making plays an extremely important role. This is namely in that form because through the lax and almost useless munitions wasting battles and machinations of the regular military, as well as of the foreign air forces, who hurl masses of rockets and bombs, the weapon industry, which delivers all the munitions for the fruitless actions against the IS, is kept alive, whereby naturally also the countries themselves profit to a great extent. This is so because they collect immense taxes from the manufacturers of fighter aircraft, weapons, munitions, rockets and bombs. Aside from that, the foreigners, especially the United States of America, can implant themselves into Iraq, into Syria, into Afghanistan, and recently also into Turkey and claim that they are providing assistance against the Islamist state. In this form they spread out in the countries concerned, as in the first position the United States of America has always done already for ages all over the world and also will continue to do, whereby it can indulge in its world control imperialism. That is to say, it can increasingly expand its endeavor in its political, military and economic areas of might and influence. And, as said, the United States of America stands ahead of all in regard to this, inconscienceless, criminal form which disdains human life and disregards every right and indeed in felonious form, and it mendaciously and deceitfully acts as world police and the selfless saver of freedom and of the world, and thereby also does not shy away from underhandedly provoking wars as it has done worldwide for ages, so indeed also in Vietnam, out of which decade-long killing, murder, raping, torture, destruction, and elimination as well as unspeakably great need, misery, pain and sorrow came forth. At that time, namely, it was on the 4th of August, as I know from your daughter Simyase, as well as from you in Quetzal, and about which I also have read something, the U.S. American Secret Service, NSA, National Security Agency, searched for a felonious way to provoke a war against the communist North Vietnam, although North Vietnam in no form had given a reason for war actions. Therefore, in the South China Sea, on the destroyer, us Mad Ducks, the NSA manufactured a faulty sonar echo, that is to say, a false sonar echo, in order to let the NSA agents officially act and indeed in the form that they consciously, falsely, and mendaciously presented the harmless and false sonar echo, created by them, as a torpedo attack of the Viet Cong. All falsified information, reports and coordinates which arose from that, which were consciously manufactured through lies and deception, proceeded immediately through the news filter of the Secret Service, NSA, which also manipulated and falsified all radio signals, photos and sea maps, and indeed besides which, on the Destroy Us Maddox, they induced an intentionally false and therefore alleged and effectively invented major combat and torpedo alarm. As a consequence, naturally the warship changed its course, whereby, with the heavy twin turrets of the destroyer, it opened fire for several hours on the imaginary and non-existent enemy, and there was wild shooting across the ocean. In addition to this, on the same day, retaliation attacks on the city of Hanoi were carried out by the U.S. aircraft carrier, Ticonderoga, with fighter aircraft. Naturally, no Vietcong ships, submarines or torpedoes were encountered at sea, because neither were there any in the area of the destroyer, nor was North Vietnam taking part in the entire thing at all. The fact is that a perfect theatrical performance was launched by the NSA, which served to make it possible for the United States of America to involve Vietcong in a war, in the hope that North Vietnam could be annexed into the area of the United States of America world controlled by the United States of America Armed Forces. But that was a complete flop, because North Vietnam did not let itself be brought into line. Rather, it humiliated the United States of America, the strongest army of the world at that time, and gave its armed forces one hammering after another during the 10-year war, and finally a complete moral and military defeat and a lost war. According to your earlier explanations, unfortunately this Vietnam War cost more than 6.5 million human lives, whereby however it is today claimed that it had only been 5 million human lives. Fundamentally also still to be said is that the armed forces in general, therefore those of all countries, are trained to boundlessly and consciencelessly kill and murder, whereby also monstrous war crimes of many forms are committed, and also women and children are sexually abused, raped, and along with many non-participating human beings from among the people, are tortured, mistreated, and murdered. But if now everything is considered further than just in regard to the mentioned human disdaining and rights disregarding machinations of the United States of America, then the U.S. American human beings step into the focus of examination. It thereby becomes clearly apparent that a great part of the United States of America population suffers from an irreversible psychosis. With a number for the entire population of around 1 million human beings, the great mass of paranoid ones amounts to a large part of the population which lives in a psycho-persecution delusion. In this great number of paranoid ones there are naturally not only simple citizens to mention, rather especially also many politicians, members of the police force, secret service people, economic heads, military personnel, political party members, religionists and sectarians, as well as hate and terrorist groups and so forth. It's all characteristic of them, therefore not only those running amok, who are constantly growing in number in the United States of America, that they believe themselves to be threatened, persecuted, and betrayed, and have irreversibly fallen into a morbid paranoia, out of which they live in the delusion that they have to eradicate, drive out, and kill all those human beings who fit into their racist image of the enemy, especially all the psychotically ill ones. Therefore the paranoiacs, who are naturally more or less psychopathically disposed, have cowardly anxiety that they, as white U.S. citizens, would be killed by human beings of other colors and other races as well as other beliefs. Thereby, quite especially the black human beings are at the forefront as the image of the enemy, which is born of the racial delusion of the white, psychosis-afflicted U.S. Americans, and are accused of wanting to kill and murder the white human beings in order to finally take control of the white race in the United States of America. And with those with the paranoid personality disorder, this cowardly anxiety and the therewith connected delusion of being murdered, as a white female or male, by a black human being, is completely irrational in the face of the affected facts and truth, which verifiably shows that the probability of being killed by a white human being is 6 times higher than being killed by a black human being. The truth is that only % of all white victims of murder are killed by blacks, while, in contrast to that, of the murders of whites are also to be attributed to white U.S. Americans. And to be said with the entire matter in regard to the spreading paranoia in a great part of the U.S. population, is that also the federal institutions are befallen by that, whereby in this regard especially the police are at the forefront, because it is a verifiable probability that an Afro-American is 7 times more likely to be shot by security forces than a white human being is. The entire thing is a consequence of the pathological delusion of persecution and of the irrational conspiracy theories, as well as of the paranoid modes of behavior of all race haters in regard to a noteworthy part of the U.S. population, whereby the fact also is that in this regard there is nowhere else in the world where the same or even only similar circumstances prevail as prevail in U.S. America. The cowardly anxiety of the white ones, indeed of the white U.S. Americans, that the Afro-Americans or other non-white ones in America could take control of the United States of America and its population, is widespread. But, in this regard, it is not only the black human beings who dominate the paranoid psychopathic body of thoughts of the U.S. American racists, because truly it is also the religions, in which they see great dangers, whereby especially the male and female Muslims, as well as the male and female Jews, embody the racist image of the enemy, because they are supposed to be a threat for the entire country, the religious and sectarian Christian faith, and for the economy. And concerning this, especially paranoid psychopathic ultra-right-wing Republicans and so-called liberal peace apostles are the greatest screamers, stink-makers and agitators of the people, whereby the Tea Party is certainly at the forefront in this regard, and sees a potential terrorist in every believer of Islam and Jewish human being. It is thereby overlooked that alone in America, since September 11th, when the World Trade Center was destroyed by Islamist Al-Qaeda terrorists, more terror attacks have been committed by white racists and twice as many human beings have been killed than by radical Islamists and Jews in the United States of America. And if the racism of the U.S. Americans is examined further, then also the radical right-wing scene comes into the focus of consideration, whereby it becomes visible that the neo-Nazis in the United States of America are well and truly on the hunt to persecute, harm, and even to murder Afro-Americans, Jews, Muslims, Mexicans, and all others who do not belong to the white U.S. American population. Belonging to these race haters are also the People's Front, Aryan Nations, and Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, and so forth, whereby solely in the Midwest of the United States of America more than Nazi organizations exist and carry out their evil racial mischief and commit ever more gavolt. And that all of that can happen is based on a further reason, being that, as a result of unemployment and the climbing poverty, a fertile ground is created for further anxiety and paranoia, which the Nazis and other racists used to win insecure human beings for the racist terror with racist lies and calumnies, whereby especially young ones are radicalized for that. But it is not only the Nazi organizations and the Ku Klux Klan as well as other known racist groups which promote the racism in the United States of America, because as unbelievable as it sounds, it is effectively also security groups and security organizations, such as the FBI, United States Federal Bureau of Investigation, which is the greatest trainer of terrorists in the United States of America, and the CIA, Central Intelligence Agency equals overseas Secret Service of the United States, which stirs up the paranoia in the population everywhere. This is done by persuading human beings, who are weak in consciousness or are somehow willing to carry out attacks and acts of terror, after which the perpetrators are, as in a stage play, hunted down and imprisoned, presented to the population through the media and then convicted. So it is a fact that since the 11th of September of the altogether failed terror attacks in the United States of America to the year, only just 6 assassination attempts did not lead back to the federal authorities. The truth also is that, in the United States of America, since the 11th September up to the year, far more than female and male human beings were shot by whites, and in the same time frame, by radical Islamists. Further to be said in regard to the U.S. American weapons delusion is that during the last years, in the United States of America, 30 children were killed through the misuse of firearms as well as, again, since the human beings died as a result of handling their own firearms and the accidental triggering of a shot. And if the truth is seen like that, then it is to be recognized that through such occurrences in the United States of America very many more victims of death are to be mourned than through an Islamist, Jewish or other terror attack from non-white human beings according to the U.S. American racial delusion. But that does not stop the world's mightiest American weapons lobby, NRA, National Rifle Association, from continuing to constantly nationally advance its insanity of the armament of the population and thereby disregarding the effective facts of the misuse of weapons. The weapons lobby, in which also the entire weapons industry is integrated, does not want to see the truth and also does not concern itself that annually there are thousands of dead to mourn due to weapons, because their interest lies only in financially profiting tremendously, for which reason they also consciously promote the anxiety and the paranoid personality disorders in the population. However, that thereby more and more running amok, murder and terror acts come about does not concern them in any form. On the contrary, they use all this very badly getting out of control of the good human nature to their benefit, because the more that happens in this form, the more they can control the population, and namely because, with the running amok, murders and terror acts and the weapons used for that, they have a mighty means of irrational anxiety through which they can dominate and control the human beings. And exactly that is done by the weapons lobby, the weapons industry, the secret services, economic bosses and other ruling ones, and indeed right up into the official agencies and the government. Therefore, with the United States of America, a paranoid psychopathic nation must be spoken of, at least in regard to the psychotic part of the entire population. Were that not the case, how could it otherwise be that there is practically always shooting first and only then questions, as the facts prove? To shoot first and then ask questions is effectively an unwritten and somehow holy rule in the United States of America, which also proves itself in the police handling of weapons and shooting, because alone in the months of January to May of the year human beings were shot by police, whereby illegalized murder is more likely the right label. And when one thinks of the racism, which is also carried out blatantly by the police, then it is not surprising that, as a rule, 4 times as many black human beings are shot than is the case on the other hand in regard to white human beings. If the situation is exactly considered, then, on one hand, cowardly anxiety is the reason for the trigger-happy police. However, on the other hand, being able to exercise their might behavior over other human beings as well as wanting to kill, and indeed especially in regard to the non-whites or those of other faiths, who do not fit into their white racial schema. And concerning this, if the entire matter is viewed and considered for the future, then the number of civil victims of the conscienceless, cowardly anxiety in the police, who are messing their trousers, will keep on increasing very drastically. And this will happen because the mass of the overpopulation incessantly continues to increase, whereby ever more conflicts of all kinds arise, which, especially in the United States of America, are confronted by anxious, cowardly, and trigger-happy police who simply consciencelessly shoot and murder the fallible, those who appear to be fallible and therefore innocent ones. And this happens with federal protection because already since time immemorial and in the future, more and more the U.S. government continues to increasingly more massively build up the weaponization and the powers of the police, while the population has nothing or hardly anything to say about that. At the present time in the United States of America there are over 800 police, whereby a certain number of them effectively are to be labeled killers in uniform and go unpunished after every murder, freely according to the rule that, as police, they have the federally assured right to shoot a human being when they feel threatened or there are other special circumstances of danger. And the whammy with this rule is that a victim does not even have to carry a weapon or attack a police officer in order to be shot by one, Because for that it is definitely enough when a human being speaks or moves clumsily, or when a police officer feels threatened, which very often is completely baseless, as such cases prove again and again. Nevertheless, the racial hatred in the United States of America spreads further through white United States of America citizens and continuously and increasingly promotes the revolt against the Afro-Americans and all others who do not fit into the white racial schema of the race haters. This U.S.-American racial hatred and the quite cowardly anxiety about the Afro-Americans, and above all about other human beings of diverse countries and religions and so forth, it corresponds to a pathological, malicious, paranoid psychopathic personality disorder, which spreads across the entire nation of United States of America and by which a large part of the U.S. population is befallen. All of the related cowardly anxiety, the racial hatred and the persecution delusion which is integrated into that, as you once said, is, on one hand, probably based effectively in a genetically inherited memory from the time when the U.S.-American world was confronted with the slavery and the therewith connected horror and murders of the slaves, which were committed by the Ku Klux Klan and other race haters. On the other hand, as you have also explained, the cowardly anxiety and the persecution delusion has been based, since time immemorial, in a genetic memory in regard to the source and the cause of the origin of the white first population of the current U.S. America. Indeed, the fact is that the majority of the current U.S. citizens are distant descendants of the early white American immigrants who immigrated to the promised land at that time only because they had to flee from Europe because they were hated, persecuted, and had their lives threatened as a consequence of their diverse religious sectarianism or their criminal lives. That created in them a hatred against all who were not like them, which, in expanded form, expressed itself as a peculiar racial hatred, indeed in regard to all those who had not fallen into a sectism, to which not only the simple citizens belonged, rather also the officials and governors. The entire thing is therefore based on a fact which genetically established itself in the sect-believing refugees and over many generations has been preserved deep in the DNA until today. Consequently, a great part of the U.S. population is the worst worldwide in regard to the cowardly anxiety of being a victim of a black or other non-white human being. The thoughts and the therefrom arising feelings of the race haters are characterized by being secure with their own body and life only with a weapon and its use against fellow human beings. So that is that. Whereby I want to say in addition to that also in regard to it an effective order will have to be created, whereby in particular the racist groups and racist organizations of all kinds, therefore also all Nazi and other groups set up on racial extremism in the United States of America, must be targeted and stamped out, and indeed through a multinational strike force for peace in accord with the schema of Nokodamian Enoch. In addition to that, I still want to say that all that I have mentioned are indisputable facts, which quite especially strongly demand that finally a worldwide multinational strike force for peace has to be created, which is trained in creating order, peace and freedom in a form worthy of the human being, through Gavalt Samagavalt Lostekkeit, and indeed also in the respect that all hatred of foreigners, faiths, religions and races is completely stopped, whereby, in this regard, in the civilized world, the United States of America is in the first position to be combated. With U.S. America it is certainly questionable when all of the racial hatred, the death penalty, the unfair exercising of punishment and administration of justice, and so forth, is viewed and considered, whether this nation can be spoken of as civilized. Now, in regard to the application of a multinational strike force for peace, this must exist and act according to Gavalt Samagavalt Lostekkeit and without any badly getting out of control of the good human nature, indeed counter to all the very badly getting out of control of the good human nature that always came about since ancient times on the earth with all armies and wars, and which also occurs in the current time in ever worse form. Therefore it means that in the battle there may only be killing in a last-minute emergency when there is no other possibility for the protection of the lives of the fighters of the multinational strike force for peace or the innocent. The fundamental form of fighting and the actual fighting procedure of the troops concerning this is based, as I know from the Nokodimian Henok storage bank data, in the opponent, or opponents, being surrounded with a considerable superior number and men, by means of all kinds of anesthetizing weapons, such as anesthetizing gas and other anesthetizing substances as well as beam and shock weapons, and so forth, being made harmless and taken prisoner. After that the prisoners are interned in secure camps and so forth, as well as banished in certain cases. Therefore it is the case that a multinational strike force for peace fulfills its duties of gewaltsam and gewaltlosigkeit in the face of wars, terrorism and atrocities, and so forth, and thereby protects the humanity in every regard, and therefore neither tortures, murders, kills nor rapes, and so forth. As I know in this regard from the storage banks, the multinational strike forces for peace of Nokodimian and Henok were therefore deployed in such a form that they firstly advanced with a great superiority of numbers and surrounded the opponents, and secondly they were not set up for killing and murder, rather only with appropriate means and weapons, for making the opponent incapable of fighting. They thereby implemented the gewaltsame and gewaltlosigkeit. They had at their disposal diverse appropriate beam weapons as well as gases and other means with which they anesthetized the opponents and made them incapable of fight, took them prisoner and finally, under certain circumstances, if it was necessary, banished them or interned them in camps. But the majority of those who were suitable for freedom and were no further danger in regard to terror acts or acts of war could return to their everyday lives and to their families after some considerable time. The same principle would also be possible with us on the earth instead of killing and murdering, because also here on this world there exist gases and other substances which a multinational strike force for peace could use in order to stop opponents, make them incapable of fighting in order to then intern them in camps, banish them, to ship them to deportation locations, or to let them go back to their everyday lives again and to their families, if they integrated themselves into peace and humanness. But the Earthlings prefer to kill, murder, torture, and rape on one hand, and on the other hand, they are so greedy for profit that they much prefer to make war booty through theft and robbery as well as maintaining munitions and weapons factories, and so forth, through which they earn billions by deploying everything altogether for murderous wars and terrorism, whereby uncountable human beings die, are wounded or become cripples, monstrous destructions come about, and also a tremendous amount of nature and its fauna and flora is destroyed.
Whereby you are right. Actually, with all forms of technology available on the earth today and with all the knowledge, it would be possible to form a multinational strike force for peace which would be equipped with all of the necessary means named by you. Consequently, with the use of gewaltsame gewaltlosigkeit, no murder and killing would occur anymore. Effectively, through suitable means and substances, opponents or fallible ones and so forth would only be made incapable of fighting by means of anesthesia, in order to then intern them in suitable camps, keep them far from the society in secured places, or to banish them.
Thereby also serious felonies of individuals or groups against fellow human beings could be avoided just as much as torture, wars, and all kinds of things which are very badly getting out of the control of the good human nature which go along with that, such as through the secret services and military of the United States of America, to which also destruction, murderous religious and other sectarianism and terrorism belong, as is the case, for example, in regard to Islamist state and its ever-spreading offshoots, as well as the Taliban and so forth. And to be said in regard to IS is that the media, journalists, politicians, and the world have still not comprehended and not understood that the IS is no Islamist state, rather it is a criminal militia which names itself Islamist state, and that therefore the IS members of Islamistan testifies to sheer stupidity, idiocy, unlogic, and unintellect. The effect of rightness and truth is namely that the real male and female Muslims are principally to be called Islamclabij or Islamic. Consequently, there exists just as serious a difference between an Islamist and an Islamic as between Islamist state and Islamist state. but unfortunately also the language experts, linguists, dictionary publishers and newspaper writers and so forth are not as educated and do not have such a good grasp in regard to the German language as the plebeians learned ones concerning this. Consequently, they also do not think logically and can neither recognize the striking difference of these terms nor can they convey and introduce them into the corresponding dictionaries and lexica, and so forth.
Which actually is the case. Through a multinational strike force for peace, also the United States of America would be stopped in its greed to be world police and in its abnormal might form. Consequently, it could no longer act in its warmongering, annexing and criminal secret service and belligerent form.
Which would also mean that the interference of the United States of America in the European Union dictatorship and in its idiotic dictatorship politics would come to an end, and thereby also the agitation against Russia, which is quite especially being driven in the EU by the German Chancellor, Angela Merkel, in cooperation with U.S. America. The European Union dictatorship politics fires up the far-reaching conflict with Russia ever further, which can still lead to very grave consequences if the European Union dictatorship and, above all, Angela Merkel does not finally change course, and instead of going towards bad confrontations with Russia, switch to a peaceful coexistence. If that does not happen, then ultimately the entirety of Europe and thereby also Switzerland will suffer, but also Russia and its member countries as well as the whole world.
That is certainly not to be doubted, if the EU carries on further in the same fire-stoking framework, which is driven on by this Angela Merkel, who, in the EU, is the decisive fundamental power of all dictatorial affectations, dictatorship endeavors, ambitions for might, incorporations of countries into the EU and, regarding this, engrossments and wrong measures,
whereby it is not noticed and not understood by the masters of creation who are at the EU helm, in their stupidity and idiocy, that they are manipulated by the reality-estranged knave chancellor, just as they are deceived by the U.S. politicians and are used through and through for their secret and time-honored plans in regard to world control, which naturally also involves the striving toward interference in the European Union dictatorship. And that is actually so, because she is effectively the decisive head person for the United States of America, in order to put their secret and underhanded efforts of being able to interfere in the European Union dictatorship into reality, and indeed in such a way that Angela Merkel works in the form of the U.S.-American insinuations and accordingly works politically, manipulatively in the European Union dictatorship. That is the reason why she is sought out and preferred by the U.S. politicians, and she does not notice in her reality-estranged naivety that she is underhandedly and unhonestly used, seduced, and has her mind poisoned for the U.S. plans. Consequently, she acts according to the U.S. insinuations which are established in her, by indoctrinating the EU mighty ones in the cunning form desired by the United States of America, and thereby prepares the way for a comprehensive influence of the United States of America in the European Union dictatorship. All those who belong to the same ranks of the EU dictatorial ones are so much in bondage to the federal chancellor, who has fallen into the reality-estranged naivety, that they do not notice how this woman has them all wrapped around her finger according to the U.S. plans, and that they are so indirectly manipulated by the United States of America. Therefore the whole thing means that, in accord with the reality-estranged knave actions and works of Angela Merkel, and in line with the U.S.-American fine details, all EU satellites are deceitfully trained for the United States of America, playing a part in the European Union dictatorship. But stupidity and idiocy just know no limits, as is the case with the federal chancellor, and indeed especially because she has a reality-estranged naivety, and thereby also one of the innumerable forms of a personality disorder, which is also connected with psychopathic forms and which leads to a might delusion. Also to say about that is that the reality-estranged naivety has nothing to do with the actual naivety, that is to say, the natural naivety, which is characteristic of many human beings and is innate at birth and is therefore to be called natural. The natural naivety, which is also called blue-eyedness and primal and harmlessly childish, can, in a shortened form which has merged into the general language usage, be regarded as naturalness, whereby arising from that, human beings who are not able to appropriately evaluate verbal remarks, circumstances, actions and situations and so forth are generally called knave, for which reason the naivety in this form is also a synonym for gullible, innocent, easily deceivable or unknowledgeable. However, this natural form of naivety has in no form something to do with the reality estranged naivety, which appears in pathologically half-witted, primal and foolish form and is based on pathological delusions as a consequence of wrong assessments, of which the befallen human being is not conscious and which also cannot be recognized by the fellow human beings, and as a rule, by experts. The delusion is based in reality estranged knave wrong estimations, wrong assessments and wrong interpretations in regard to expositions, presentations, things, decisions, clarifications, events, situations, occurrences, speech, facts and matters as well as in lacking knowledge of human nature, and so forth. Furthermore, also connected with that are personal, wrong forms of viewing and considering, delusional believing, guilefulness, egoism, self-deceit, self-enticement, estrangement from reality and lack of recognition of reality. From that there arise wrong viewpoints and forms of understanding, and indeed because the reality of a matter, and so forth, is not comprehended, not recognized and consequently also not appraised in a real correct form, and therefore can neither be assessed nor realistically evaluated. That leads to the effectively existing facts and actuality being completely wrongly interpreted and, consequently from that wrong and dangerous decisions being made and naturally also correspondingly erroneous and confused actions being carried out, through which much terribleness is caused in many kinds of forms. And this is especially the case with reality estranged knave human beings, in regard to verbal utterances, presentations, explanations as well as the modes of behavior and conduct of other human beings who get into the focus of one who is pathologically knave due to estrangement from reality, whereby it plays no role whether the entirety of the matter which gets into the attentiveness of the reality estranged knave one relates to something familial, societal, philosophical, political, private, religious, sectarian, or purely worldly. Thereby, concerning this, everything is connected with anxieties about failure and persecution delusion which are suppressed outwardly for the fellow human beings to the point of not being detectable, but which are masked by an especially pathologically hoggish commitment to a matter as well as through an extremely shrewd and indeed intelligent, suggestive dictatorial demeanor as well as perfect play acting and a false competence demeanor. The entire thing works in this form on the fellow human being such that a reality estranged knave one who acts in this form is wrongly appraised as being a very considerate, decisive human being who is sure in actions and is competent, and is therefore praised excessively. As your father Sva hath already taught me, and as you taught me on various occasions and explained to me during the course of our friendship, the actual reality estranged naivety is to be labeled against intellect and rationality, literally also insane or also megalomaniacal. The whole thing is based pathologically on a serious inferiority complex and a psychical disorder which is transformed through self-deceit into megalomania and imperiousness and is outwardly play-acted as comprehensive competence and is consequently not recognized by the fellow human beings and even by experts. In its center, this form of the reality estranged naivety is based on dominating delusions, which call forth anxieties of failure, anxieties of persecution or, in the worst case, an acute persecution delusion, as well as a distorted perception of the effective, real reality and its truth. As a rule, human beings who are reality estranged knave fall into the same category as natural knave ones and suffer from the same symptoms as them. However, are able to cover their reality estranged naivety and therewith their personality disorder so perfectly that, as I said, it cannot even be detected by experts, not to mention by lay people who are untrained concerning this. A reality estranged knave human being sees in his or her environment as well as, by and large, in descriptions, presentations, things, explanations, facts, events, speech, situations and occurrences, and in any human beings, a hostile, and in extreme cases, even malicious persecutory attitude towards him or her, when all of it does not correspond to his or her own view and opinion and everything does not fit into his or her personal field of viewing and considering, understanding, rationality and desire, nor in his or her endeavors and into his or her objectives. This is so, while in regard to the same factors, a human being in his or her reality estranged naivety just takes everything at face value, and accordingly also unconcernedly and inconsiderately acts in the form suggested to him or her, when he or she is led to believe that someone is of the same view and opinion, and of the same mind as him or her. Fundamentally, in his or her delusion, a reality-estranged naive human being sees everything in an effectively reality-estranged form and according to his or her own views and his or her personal opinion. Consequently, he or she assesses circumstances in a way that is confusingly wrong, and even also condemns them. But that leads to completely wrong and confused views and a basically wrong opinion arising in him or her, which he or she suggestively conveys to fellow human beings, influences them according to his or her sense and brings them to his or her reality-estranged naive confused line and turns them into blind followers, without them perceiving that they are put under pressure and are led into the unreal. The reality-estranged naive human being, like the actual, natural naive one, is controlled by an anxious or aggressive mistrust in regard to other human beings, whereby the whole thing leads delusionally to the conviction that any human being who gets into his or her focus would plot against him or her. But paradoxically, that does not prevent the reality-estranged naive one from being like naturally naive human beings, namely innocent, childish, gullible, unknowing, easily deceived, and simple-minded, and foolish indeed beyond the normal naive one. Consequently, he or she cannot evaluate the events, actions, situations, circumstances, and descriptions, things, insinuations, facts, lies, speech, guidelines, and calumnies, and so forth, which are suggestively introduced to him or her, in any appropriate form. This is a fact that means that, also through the deceitfulness and other machinations of any human being, the reality-estranged naive human being can, in this form, be extremely strongly negatively influenced and manipulated in a form which is not consciously perceptible for him or her. But it also means that a human being, who is naive in a reality-estranged form, in many regards is not able to recognize and understand, in a reality-based form, that which is effective and real as well as views, statements, descriptions, things, events, opinions and circumstances, and so forth. Rather wrongly interprets everything in a reality-estranged naive way and therefore interprets the opposite to that which is basically given or meant. Therefore, through the reality-estranged naivety, there arises from the human being befallen by it, a form of viewing and considering in regard to something, from which there comes forth a wrong interpretation of the situation and accordingly also a completely wrong appraisal opposite to the matter, as well as a wrong action and behavior. And exactly that is the case in regard to the Federal Chancellor Merkel who, in her reality-estranged naivety, does not recognize the suggestive influences, which are directed at her, of the United States of America's federally responsible politicians, and consequently is not able to recognize nor assess the effective scope of these U.S. influences. Thereby she is an unknowing and willing plaything of the U.S. politics and, according to its sense, in the EU dictatorially directs the line and the mode of behavior of all the EU politicians, however, completely unnoticed by the stupid idiotic mighty ones of the EU dictatorship. And this is because they do not know the true face of the Chancellor any more than they do the effective backgrounds which are given through the suggestive influencing by the U.S. politicians, whereby the whole matter of the United States of America playing a part in the European Union dictatorship is at the forefront, but also U.S. America's world control desires as well as a free trade agreement between the United States of America and the European Union dictatorship. And when the spectrum of the reality-estranged naivety of which I talk is viewed and considered, then under certain circumstances, as with the actual reality-estranged human being, this reaches from neurotic inclinations to serious psychotic characteristics. However, which are so suppressed and veiled by the reality-estranged knave one that the whole thing cannot be perceived by the fellow human beings and even by trained experts. But, under certain circumstances, precisely that is extremely dangerous for the environment and indeed especially in regard to politics, especially in the present connection which concerns the machinations of the European Union dictatorship against Russia. As with an essentially neurotic human being, a reality-estranged knave one is characterized just as much by an exaggerated sensitivity regarding rejections, being easily aggrieved and mistrust, which leads to him or her mightfully putting himself or herself in the foreground with gavil, lies and deceit, bootlicking and with all other conceivable means, and indeed even when he or she has to stop at nothing. In this form the reality-estranged human being who is befallen by delusion, and indeed, in this form, having a personality disorder, believes that even neutral or friendly actions of other human beings are hostilely or disdainfully directed against him or her. In this form, constantly recurring and unjustified accusations are delusionally raised by this kind of knave human being against all those fellow human beings, who, as I already said, do not share his or her view and opinion and do not fit into his or her schema of intellect and rationality, and also not into his or her objectives which he or she extremely suggestively, jealously, dictatorially conveys to others, and when necessary, also cantankerously fights for. Perhaps you can just explain what is to be understood by reality-estranged naivety, perhaps in the form as Sver hath explained it to me and as you also precisely explained to me and as I now have attempted to recall the whole thing to some extent. You, as a skilled expert, can do that certainly better than I can. To my knowledge, the term reality-estranged naivety is not known in the teaching of terrestrial medicine, as well as psychology and psychiatry, and so forth, for which reason I think that a short explanation from you would certainly be good.
That which you have presented from my father's teaching and explanations and from mine is absolutely applicable and so detailed that actually everything necessary has thereby been said, but I will nonetheless happily still contribute something short about that. Fundamentally, like paranoia, reality-estranged naivety is characterized by a particular sensitivity regarding rejections, bearing grudges, being easily aggrieved, exaggerated mistrust, and so forth, whereby still to add to that is an inclination to interpret that which is experienced in the direction of tendencies which are hostile towards oneself. The reality-estranged knave human being rebels, through a deep-reaching might demeanor and through all kinds of similarly directed modes of behavior, and often also through revenge machinations, against everything which does not correspond to his or her view and opinion construct, whereby in this form he or she exerts might over fellow human beings, which happens in extremely insidious form and is not realized by those human beings who are involved in it. A further thing to say regarding that is that a reality-estranged knave human being, just like a paranoiac, defines neutral and friendly actions of others as hostile, pejorative or disparaging, whereby in this way these impositions are also experienced by him or her in a thought-feeling-based form. Thereby, also a delusional jealousy emerges which is directed against the views, the opinions and might of others, who are deemed to be adversaries if they do not conform to his or her own reality-estranged knave modes of behavior. As a rule, the whole matter of the reality-estranged naivety also leads to unjustified suspicions in regard to an incapability of those fellow human beings who are viewed and considered to be stupid, and, in regard to intellect, rationality and the ability to make decisions as well as the ability to act, are viewed and considered to be without intellect and without rationality, and consequently, in line with the delusion of the reality-estranged knave human being, must be dictatorially taught, correctly led and guided through his or her intellect and rationality. That is the actual might behavior of the reality-estranged knave human being, who is additionally also stubborn and quarrelsome and brings this to the fore in such form that the fellow human beings, who are directed and suggestively dictatorially led by him or her, do not perceive that they are steered selfishly and imperiously through the machinations of the reality-estranged knave one. Human beings with a reality-estranged knave personality disorder are controlled by a false and inflated self-worth delusion and by a greatly exaggerated self-centeredness delusion, as well as by an insatiable egoism and by an insistence on being right, whereby, under certain circumstances, the reality estranged knave state can also be associated with a paranoid schizophrenia and an actual paranoia. Basically, in every case, a reality estranged naivety concerns a psychical disorder, in which, significantly, also psychopathic influences are present. Consequently, therefore, a reality estranged knave human being is without doubt, in a certain way, also a psychopath. This is a fact which, naturally, as a consequence of the perfect acting skill, the psychopath knows how to conceal outwardly so much that, as a rule, at least lay people, as well as very often also experts, are not able to perceive and therefore also not recognize, not define and not understand his or her personality disordered disposition. Consequently, also the mightful decisions, actions and modes of behavior of a reality estranged knave human being are not recognized, which leads to the reality estranged knave one, who, as a consequence of his or her psychopathy, has a pronounced acting capability at his or her disposal, being able to transfix the fellow human beings, deceive them and win their unjustified trust, which often leads to quarrel and strife as well as to far-reaching unpeace among the human beings with whom they interact. And wars frequently arise, and acts of revenge and retribution as well as hate and destruction, if reality estranged knave ones stoke the corresponding embers long enough until they become a blazing fire and inextinguishable conflagration.
Thank you for your explanation, whereby now, that which is called reality estranged naivety by Euclides is certainly also clearly explained, whereby, as I already have said, according to my knowledge, this form of naivety is unknown by terrestrial experts of medicine, psychology and psychiatry, and so forth.
That corresponds to correctness, because the corresponding experts, which they believe themselves to be, have never yet, since time immemorial, concerned themselves with this form of personality disorder, and indeed also not in the new time. That means that, in this regard, but also in regard to the entirety of the human psyche and its thousandfold forms of illnesses, maladies and disorders, and so forth, they still have very much to learn. And this is so because, up to the present time, in regard to the necessary cognitions and the necessary knowledge, they are so behind that they do not even know a third of the effective extent of all possible variations of that which exists and is possible in regard to human beings psychically getting very badly out of control of the good human nature, and in regard to psychical illnesses, suffering and disorders, and so forth. Thereby also to be heeded is that, in this regard, as a consequence of the growth of the population, continuously new forms and variations of psychical disorders emerge and therefore expand their manifoldness.
Then it is clear why great unknowledge still prevails with the earthlings concerning this in the fields of medicine, psychology and psychiatry, because when I think that, regarding psychopathy alone, several thousand variations appear, then the unknowledge is also understandable. It is thereby only regrettable that the physicians, psychologists and psychiatrists and other experts, which they often only believe themselves to be, consider themselves to be great and clever and are of the view that they would know everything necessary amply up to the plus ultra. Consequently, they would have nothing more to learn about that.